Hello everyone, I'm Congresswoman Debbie Mucarsel-Powell. I represent Florida's 26th Congressional District, which includes the beautiful Florida Keys and the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. Preserving our oceans and marine sanctuaries is something very near and dear to my heart. I know how crucial it is for our marine ecosystems to be healthy and resilient. In South Florida, like it is in many parts of our country, our oceans and coastlines are everything. They give us our sense of community. They're a huge economic driver, and they're also important for our health and well-being, especially during these times when we're all a little extra stressed. But our oceans, coastlines, and reefs are struggling. I'm a scuba diver. It's one of my favorite things to do, and in my opinion, it's one of the best ways to appreciate all that's below the surface. Before I came to Congress, I did work at the Coral Restoration Foundation, and I've seen over the past several years the increased damage to our ecosystem. I've seen firsthand the degradation of our coral reefs, and unless we act collectively and quickly, we unfortunately will continue to see further decline. We don't have all the answers, but thanks to scientists and conservation and restoration organizations like yourselves, we know what we can and must do. Protecting our environment is one of my top priorities in Congress. I'm working every day to move Everglades restoration along quickly because I know how important a healthy Everglades is to our water quality in Florida Bay and the Keys. I'm fighting offshore drilling efforts and attempts to strip important environmental regulations. I am pushing to fund coral restoration efforts, and I'm collaborating with my colleagues to mitigate the effects of climate change and spur innovation and investment in natural infrastructure. These issues are so important, and I want to thank each and every one of you for your hard work on these issues. It's no easy task, but I am confident that together we can build a sustainable, healthy environment that everyone can benefit from. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nicole LeBoeuf, and I'm the Acting Assistant Administrator of NOAA's National Ocean Service. I will be your moderator for this panel, Restoring Our Waters. I'm excited for using this virtual format today for Capitol Hill Oceans Week, especially as we reflect upon protecting our ocean's biodiversity. At the National Ocean Service, or NOS, we think a lot about restoration, whether it's part of our damage assessment efforts in the wake of a chemical or oil spill, or in our sanctuary system where protecting biodiversity is one of our primary goals. Whether I am in one of our national estuarine research reserves where science of restoration is on the cutting edge, or I'm working with our Coral Reef Conservation Program on efforts in the United States and around the world, restoration is something we care about very deeply at NOS. As many of you know, restoration often goes beyond protection and attempts to reverse the damage to species and habitats. It often is about human connections and making connections to society about the good work that we do so that they all value restoration as much as we do. Restoration is a complex affair. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made. We are hoping to address key aspects of restoration with today's panel. As moderator, I will do my best to get us quickly through several discussion themes, including the use of diverse partnerships and collaborations, and what it's like to be in dialogue and communication across sectors, considerations associated with upstream and downstream threats, both figuratively and literally, when it comes to habitat and biodiversity loss, the identification and application of new and innovative ideas, approaches, and technologies, restoration as a function of bringing back what was in the past versus restoring what the conditions will be in the future. And if we have time, I'd like to hear from the panelists about how COVID-19 pandemic has impacted their work and whether there are opportunities for the world of restoration amidst all of this uncertainty and health concern. With that, we've got a fantastic lineup of restoration practitioners here today, and I know we're going to have a stimulating discussion. I can't wait to hear about how these experts address challenges and find success in restoration. At this time, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists and ask them to tell a bit about their work and perhaps how they got into it and what they get out of restoration. First, we have Bryce Semmens from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, here to introduce a restoration success story called Grouper Moon. Go ahead, Bryce.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Today I'm going to give you a brief story about a conservation success in the Cayman Islands, featuring this guy right here. This is a Nassau Grouper. Nassau Grouper are a critically endangered Caribbean reef fish species. And they're endangered because it turns out they form these giant spawning aggregations. They do that very predictably during the winter full moons. And during that time, they get together from a very large area into a very small area where thousands of individuals gather, and it's the only time during the year that they reproduce. Now, for well over 100 years, this has been an important fishery in the Caribbean, but over time, as technology has improved and things like refrigeration has come online, this fishery has turned from sustainable to unsustainable. And in a modern context, most of these aggregations, if not nearly all, have been fished to the point of exhaustion. There are very few remaining. That's happened everywhere in the Caribbean, and the Cayman Islands are no different. They used to have as many as 7 different aggregations. And by the early 80s, the fishermen in the Cayman Islands had recognized that they were no longer catching fish the way they used to. And they went to the Cayman Islands Department of Environment and asked them to look into what was going on. And it was then that the Cayman Islands Department of Environment did some of the most foundational work with regard to fisheries biology for the species, doing things like age and growth studies. And so there's a long history of science-based fisheries management in the Cayman Islands. Well, fast forward to 2001, and on the tiny island of Little Cayman, a new aggregation is discovered. And at the time of discovery, that aggregation is by far the largest remaining anywhere in the Caribbean. And because of the history of overfishing, the well-known history of overfishing in the Cayman Islands, the government acted to protect that aggregation. And even though they acted quickly, they did not act quickly enough to stop all take. And in fact, in the few short years before discovery to protection, well more than half of all those aggregating fish were removed. But still, those protections put in place conserved a large remaining aggregation. And it was at that point that the Cayman Islands Department of Environment, which is kind of like our Fish and Wildlife Service, began working with the nonprofit organization Reef, the Reef Environmental Education Foundation. And Reef is a citizen science marine-based nonprofit. And together they established science based on diving to gather information necessary to drive adaptive management for the species. And so it works like this. The Cayman Islands Department of Environment works with Reef, the nonprofit, as well as academic partners and international governmental scientists to generate scientific questions that are important to understand the context of success in terms of management. They carry out the science on the aggregation, give the science to the Department of Environment, who then synthesizes that into actionable management strategies that is then passed to the Cayman Islands government for legislation. After that legislation goes into place, the Grouper Moon Partnership gets back to work to do more science to understand the effectiveness of that legislation, and the cycle repeats. And so this is a truly science-driven adaptive management that ultimately has met with dramatic success. So just this past year, we established some results after the roughly 2 decades worth of science, and demonstrated that in the last 15 years or so, this population has more than quadrupled. From a tiny island, roughly 12 kilometers in length, the aggregation now is closing in on 9,000 individuals. So a huge population and a remarkable recovery. And the last thing I'd like to point out is that conservation science and management in a vacuum is not largely going to be effective. There needs to be some interaction between the science and the people. And so we have worked hard in the Cayman Islands to connect with the Caymanian people, both in terms of K through 12 education and outreach curricula, where we're in the schools year round, and also during the winter months of research, we have live from the field broadcasts, both above and below water. And finally, we work at times directly with the fishermen with our science, and every year have town halls where we can display and distribute and disseminate the science that we've done to the fishing community. And this is very important because the fishermen have sacrificed to make this conservation happen. They've given up the opportunity to fish at this aggregation in an effort to motivate conservation success for the species. So it's important that we relay that message of success back to them to demonstrate the fruits of their effort. And with that, I will say thank you.
Thank you, Bryce. That was great. Next, I'll ask Aaron Adams to tell us more about his work with the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. Take it away, Aaron.
Thanks, Nicole. Typically, when we think about restoration, we think about projects that occur in a specific location, like restoring a wetland or maybe restoring an oyster bar. But restoration isn't very effective unless the causes of the declines are addressed first. And often the causes are what we call upstream issues. So for example, a decline in water quality might cause an alteration of freshwater flows, cause plankton blooms, etc. And so the actual restoration that we think of wetland or oyster bar is downstream, the downstream restoration. So to put it more graphically, we take a river, we alter its flows, we add nutrients to that system, we get plankton blooms, which then cause oyster mortality. But if restoration downstream is going to be successful, we have to address the upstream problem. Addressing the problems also includes education and advocacy. In Florida, this means that we're working to advocate for converting septic tanks to sewage treatment, updating sewage treatment plants, restoring natural freshwater flows. This involves a lot of implementation of policy changes and interacting with the policymakers. But these are also often on large spatial scales. Here shows a graphic of an example of Florida Everglades restoration. On the left is historic flow, in the middle is what's currently now the freshwater flows, and on the right is what is hoped it will happen after the Everglades are restored. And so Everglades restoration is essential to the health of the Florida Keys, Florida Bay, Southeast Florida, and Southwest Florida. So you have a lot of downstream problems that are in need of upstream solutions. On the downstream end, Bonefish Tarpon Trust works with partners to identify locations for habitat restoration and protection, focusing mostly on juvenile species, juvenile fish like tarpon and snook. Focusing on juvenile habitats allows us to work in that kind of coastal margin where a lot of the habitat degradation occurs. We also focus on economically important fisheries, like the flats fishery in the Florida Keys for bonefish, permit, and tarpon, which has an annual economic impact exceeding $465 million. Because these species are high economic value and charismatic, we consider them umbrella species. We're able to use them to leverage funding and policy changes. And the charismatic aspect is highlighted here by this picture from going back to 1930 on a cover of a magazine, and those magazine cover shots continue. So these fish use a wide variety of coastal habitats during the life cycle. So if we protect and restore the habitats that they depend on, that also protects the many other species that use those habitats that aren't nearly as charismatic or might not be worth the direct economic value. An example of our downstream habitat restoration work is in mangrove areas in Southwest Florida. This particular spot where we're focusing for juvenile tarpon and snook is an abandoned coastal community with remnant canals. We are redesigning those remnant canals to now mimic mangrove creeks that will hopefully provide habitat for juvenile tarpon and snook. This also gives us the ability to test different designs of restoration with different depths, types of vegetation, the amount of tidal connectivity, that types of things, to see which work best. And working with numerous partners at the state and local levels to accomplish this, with the goal of expanding this approach more broadly throughout the state and throughout the region. So that gives a brief summary of BTT's broad-scale approach to habitat restoration and some of the projects that we're involved with. And with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Aaron, thank you so much. Now, please welcome Vince Cavalieri of the National Park Service, who will introduce us to the Great Lakes Piping Plover Recovery Project. You're up next, Vince. You ready?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so today I'd like to talk a little bit about shorebird conservation, particularly the Great Lakes piping plover. Many folks who might be used to more aquatic ocean issues might not think about shorebird conservation frequently, but of course many shorebirds rely on nearshore oceanic habitats for at least parts of their life cycle. Many shorebirds tie the world together is often a thing we say. There's species like red knot that migrate all the way from Tierra del Fuego in southern South America all the way to the Canadian Arctic, and are utilizing habitats throughout that winter migration and breeding range. So very quickly, the piping plover is a North American endemic shorebird species. It is listed as both threatened and endangered by Fish and Wildlife Service, depending on which one of these three populations it comes from. Today, I'm going to talk about the Great Lakes piping plover in a little more detail, which breeds solely on shorelines of the Great Lakes. Historically, Great Lakes piping plovers occurred throughout the Great Lakes. Up to 500 to 600 pairs are thought to have existed historically, basically anywhere there was sandy habitats in the Great Lakes. By the late 1980s, the birds were very close to extirpation. In fact, there was only 12 pairs left by 1990. In 1986, the birds were listed as endangered by Fish and Wildlife Service. What happened? Primarily habitat loss, including direct loss of beach to development, increased pressure from beach recreation throughout their life cycle, both winter and breeding, and as well as an increased number of predator species due to anthropogenic changes. To deal with this, after listing, a multi-partner recovery program is gradually developed that includes many, many different partners and across federal, state, tribal, nonprofit, and university research partners have all combined to come together to try to protect the species and recover the species. The primary conservation objectives include research, which informs our management, protection, as well as habitat restoration that has gradually started to bring the plovers back. Recovery plan, like all endangered species in the U.S., was developed, and we're trying to get 150 pairs of piping plovers for 5 consecutive years as one of our main recovery goals. And we're gradually getting there. You can see that early on we had sub 20 pairs, and we've gradually worked up to get close to about 75 to 80 pairs in the Great Lakes. And I mentioned, shorebirds tying the world together. You can see here all our birds are banded, and they migrate between the Great Lakes, where the green dots are seen, and then migration and wintering sites are in yellow. So you can see birds go to the Great Lakes to a wide variety of nearshore habitats on both the Gulf Coast and the Southern Atlantic Ocean. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Vince. Okay, lastly, we've got Scott Winters. Let us in on that great work you're doing in the Coral Restoration Foundation.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm Scott Winters. I'm the CEO of the Coral Restoration Foundation. And what I want to talk to you about today is a gigantic restoration project that we and a bunch of other partners are taking on in the Florida Keys. The best way to understand the Florida Keys is to see them.
Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary protects one of the world's exceptional barrier reefs. The coral reefs provide crucial habitat for fish, sea turtles, and more. The Keys are also a renowned destination for diving, snorkeling, and fishing. But the coral reefs of the Florida Keys need our help. Hurricanes, warming temperatures, disease, poor water quality, and heavy use have led to catastrophic decline. While some problems are global, bold local action can change the trajectory of coral reef health and protect the economy that depends on them. NOAA and its partners are launching an unprecedented restoration effort to recover 7 iconic coral reefs in the Florida Keys. Mission Iconic Reefs represents one of the largest investments ever undertaken in coral restoration. This ambitious plan embraces innovative techniques to rebuild coral reef structure, restore ecosystem function, and promote resiliency. Working together with world-renowned scientists, restoration partners, government agencies, and passionate individuals, we can put Florida's coral reefs on track for recovery. Join the mission to protect and restore these iconic reefs.
The planning effort itself involved dozens of parties, some of which are listed here, over a year-long process. Initially, the entire Florida reef tract was evaluated and 37 reefs identified as strong opportunities. These were critically evaluated and 7 reefs were selected as having the highest chance of restoration success based on past work and local conditions. These reefs are Carysfort Reef, Horseshoe, Dry Chica Rocks, Sombrero Reef, Newfound Harbor, Blue Key, and Eastern Dry Rocks. The approach to restoration here is massive. We're looking at 3 million square feet of restoration. As a result, so too is the plan. Each reef was mapped in detail. And for each part of the reef by site, specific targets by species were determined. And not just for corals, but for site preparation and reintroduction of other community components. The project has a 20-year goal to move us from 2% coral cover to 25% coral cover on the Florida reef tract, broken into different phases. Most importantly, this effort would not be possible without the immense effort of lots of parties. It involves government agencies from local to federal, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, academic universities, and for-profit businesses such as dive operators to help manage the reef, thus creating additional off-season revenue sources and economic stimulus for the region. And most importantly, the public. Through multiple means, everyone, public means in the public, can have the opportunity to both learn about what we're doing and participate in the work. The key here is we're not trying to make a museum, we're saving an asset for the entire community. And the work is going to take an entire community to get done. Thank you, Nicole.
Gosh, that's great. Thank you, Scott. Okay, so let's talk about our themes a little bit. There was something that I definitely noticed in the descriptions of your work was the importance of partnerships and collaborations, and really lots of diversity there. It seems like that is part and parcel to what you do. I would like thoughts from the panelists on whether that is true for you, whether I was picking up on the right thing there, and what approaches you use to identify and retain your most successful partnerships. I'd like to start with Brice, if that's okay, and then others chime in as you feel the need.
Yeah, for the Grouper Moon project, the partnership has been the linchpin to success. It's really been something that is absolutely critical. For the project, it's important to recognize that those partners are kind of on equal footing. So it's not like U.S. scientists coming to the Cayman Islands and telling them what to do. It's really the whole group working together to identify the right questions for the science at hand, which isn't necessarily just about science. It's also about the way in which legislation and management happens in the Cayman Islands. So we have to work together as a team. And so to the question of what makes for good partnerships and the ones that you keep around, it's honestly, it's personal relationships and being able to work in that kind of an environment, being able to work collaboratively and recognize you're on equal footing. That's worked well for us. And the last thing I'll say about the partnerships is, man, it is really great to have a diversity of partners, because all of the different perspectives they bring really diversifies the science and the ideas behind the correct approaches to affect positive change. And so the bigger the tent, the broader the diversity of ideas to ultimately meet with success.
That's great. Anyone else? Scott, sure.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think knitting together a couple of the themes with both upstream and downstream and involving lots of different people. All restoration projects are about protecting a community asset for the public. So without having as diverse public input and engagement, it will be successful, right? People only care about and will only save what's in their backyard. So making these restoration projects about everyone's backyard is what's really the key to success that we have found.
Yeah, that's a great connection. Sure, Vince, go ahead. You want to add to that?
Yeah, certainly. I agree completely with Scott and Brice that, big tents and bringing in a lot of different partners who are all impacted or have an investment in the resource is really important. We've gotten a lot of Great Lakes tribal involvement in this program in recent years, and that's really brought a new perspective. And last year we got a pair of plovers in like downtown Chicago. So that brought in a completely different group of people that we're gradually trying to incorporate into our recovery program. And, I think we've only benefited from getting lots of different voices.
That's great. And Aaron, you actually spoke about downstream and upstream in your presentation. What do you take on this?
Yeah, there's so many different tendrils here. I mean, it's interesting. 30 years ago, let's say, when conservation and restoration science were pretty new, it was 100% about the biology. And the people aspect of it was secondary, if not tertiary. And that's evolved over the years, which is great to see because it is very interactive. There have been some past protection and restoration efforts that actually displace people. And that's not how things work now. So I think a word to folks who want to become involved in restoration is to, as all of us on the panel seem to be doing, is work from the ground up. You have to, as a scientist, go in and understand not only the natural systems, which takes a lot of time, in my case in the water, but it also takes a lot of time with the people. Bryce mentioned that, interacting with the people. And as a fish conservation biologist, restoration biologist, I have to spend a lot of times on docks or on boats, which I enjoy, talking to the people who use the resource. I think that's a huge part of it. So as scientists, whether academic, government, or private, nonprofit, we have to be just as integrated in the communities as communities are in the restoration. And a lot of times we have to go in and get involved in some pretty intensive education. And I'm sure every one of the panelists has had to start from the beginning many times and kind of explain the basic biology all the way up to how it affects the people using the resource. And education is a massive component of developing the relationships overall. I think it's as important that it's a two-way street. We're asking the stakeholders we deal with to contribute, sometimes sacrifice. We have to, at the very least, reply to them with all of the information on successes, failures, and everything else that the restoration involved. And it's really refreshing to see all these different projects focused on that as a big aspect, because that's what's going to make us successful.
So Scott, one of your slides highlighted the work of Everglades restoration and those downstream effects. How do you prioritize where you put your energy, whether it's actual, tanks in the water, or education and outreach, whether it's at the site or upstream?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We feel that it has to be an equal mix of both, right? The restoration work in the water is only as good as the people who are going to benefit from it understand that work and be equal participants in it. As I said on my last slide, we're not looking to build a museum. This is an asset. We're looking to build an asset to give back to the community. And that requires a lot of education, both in incorporating them into why we're doing it and making them part of the process. And that leads into how to sustainably use it moving forward. So it's that social component, which is equally important to the actual restoration.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Brice.
So just touching on that theme of upstream, downstream, I think that's a really important one in the context of restoration action. In our world, for instance, having an understanding of the upstream downstream connection of spawning sites in the Caymans and in the Caribbean in general was really important for setting expectations for recovery. What we found was that the population did not respond right away. What I showed you, if you look carefully, was what the population looked like from 2007 on. For the first several years following protections, the population wasn't recovering. And in retrospect, that's not surprising because there is no other aggregation anywhere near the Caymans that exists anymore to supply new grouper to show up. So we had to rely on the ocean gods to bring Cayman larvae back to Cayman in order to start that recovery process. And so if you don't understand the context of that upstream downstream connection between your restoration project and everywhere else, you may miss the target or have unrealistic expectations for what's possible. In our context, it's good news, bad news. The bad news happened first, which is that recovery didn't happen right away. The good news is, in theory, we have now created the new upstream for everybody else. So we have the potential now to seed a recovery in the rest of the Caribbean as an effective management program in the Caymans. So here's hoping on that.
Yeah, Scott, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I really want to echo what Brice said because I think it's really important. And emphasize it's important for us to work at all levels. So upstream at our restoration project and downstream. We can't just focus on solving what people think are the ultimate causes. We have to work across this full continuum if we want to make a significant change.
All right, thanks. Aaron, do you want to give us one more point on that?
Yeah, just to maybe wrap it up is going back to the education component. Myself and others, we've all talked about it. You utilize, I guess the term is citizen science nowadays, in our projects, which is fantastic. Say going out, restoring mangrove, putting propagules in the ground, which is fantastic. But something we have to do better is to broaden that education. So people realize that when they're sticking that mangrove propagule into the ground, or they're counting the grouper, or identifying a plover nest, they also have to, in their own mind, think much bigger. So they understand how their actions locally affect a much bigger scale, which will then hopefully adjust their behaviors so that those upstream causes aren't circling back and kind of defeating us in the end.
Yeah, good point. So let's talk a little bit about innovations and technologies. How do you all go about either identifying, developing, or adopting new approaches, whether it's technological approach or a new restoration method? And is it slow to uptake? Do you just get right at it? I'd love to hear from you all about how you incorporate new approaches. Scott, can we start with you on that? You guys are doing some cool stuff in the Keys.
Yeah, so coral reefs are in a dire state, so we need as much help as possible. So one of the key aspects that we did a few years ago is to co-form an international consortium that not only includes restoration practitioners and researchers, but we reached out to entirely different disciplines, engineers, product development, fabricators, and really tried to outline our solution and think outside of the box. How could we solve this in completely new and creative ways? And it's ranged anywhere from genetic interventions to utilizing artificial intelligence to now map the bottom, you know, to trying to develop new films and new polymers to attach corals to the bottom. So trying to put the problem out there to as many people as possible, especially in other disciplines, we found was absolutely necessary because we were just couldn't move it forward anymore.
That's fantastic. And you snuck your way all the way back to the partnerships and collaborators theme. That's great. Anyone else want to talk about innovative approaches or new methods? Maybe if it's hard to adopt them. Yeah, Vince, go ahead.
Sure. So one thing we've been trying to do in the plover world is really starting with habitat restoration, which, you know, for a lot of other terrestrial species, methods have been worked out long ago, but some of the coastal, like beach restoration, habitat restoration, it has been kind of slow in coming because, you know, it's such an ephemeral habitat. And, you know, how to do it in any kind of lasting way has been a challenge. But I think it, just like Scott said, it's bringing in these new partners with innovative ideas. Recently, we've begun to do some of these projects in the Great Lakes and on the Atlantic coast as well, bringing in the Army Corps of Engineers, getting a different perspective, trying to figure out how to do it. And, you know, it's a bit of trial and error. But you know, we're gradually working there through our research partners, trying to, you know, figure out the right way to use new technologies and new methods.
Awesome. Yeah, Bryce, what you got?
Yeah, so when we started the project in 2001, there was no such thing as digital cameras. That didn't exist. You know, artificial intelligence wasn't really a thing. So much has evolved so rapidly over those last 20 years. It's super exciting to see how quickly these new technologies are coming online and able to be incorporated into the science that we do. So, for instance, Scott mentioned artificial intelligence. We've recently started using all of our old video, you know, going all the way back to our, you know, Super 8 video that we had from the early days, and we've actually digitized all of those thousands of hours of video and pulled out using AI software individual fish and are doing facial recognition on grouper, kind of like how your Apple phone does it on your face. We're doing that with grouper, and that's allowing us to actually start to track individuals over years. And so we're starting to get this great information that we never imagined we would be able to get from these videotapes that we had originally, in terms of things like demographic rates, growth, survival, all of those things that are happening. So it is a super exciting time right now to be in the field of restoration ecology, because technology is really starting to broaden our ability to address these challenges.
One of the things that we are really pushing, it's not a new technology or innovation, maybe a different way of thinking, is trying to integrate the habitat restoration directly into fisheries management. Typically what happens with habitat restoration per se is it's almost opportunistic, or you go for the places that are the most damaged or what you think is the most savable. But from a fish conservation, fisheries management perspective, that's not always the most effective. You know, as to take a line from a movie, location, location, location. So wetland restoration in place A may have more impact, positive impact on the fishery than on place B. Scott talked about that some with their selection of reefs. Some reefs they didn't use may look bad, but it wouldn't have done much for them or for the systems that they support to restore them. And so I think moving forward, and everyone's doing this to a certain extent, we have to really push the line on changing the way we integrate, or actually integrating fisheries management with habitat restoration, or whatever fisheries restoration, so that it's not two hands have to know what they're doing, the other hands are doing. And so if we can prioritize restoration and actually measure our success or failures in that respect, going down the road, we'll have many more successes, as Brice is having. And now that Brice knows what his site is doing, and we have enough oceanographic models, he can now predict downstream areas that should benefit, which then feeds back into their fisheries. So that's another example from just what I've heard on this panel. But that's something that BTT is pushing, and I think more of us in restoration have to start pushing the resource management agencies as well to take that next step.
Okay. Yeah. Scott, did you want to add something else?
Just briefly, I just wanted to put a plug out there. There are lots of people who aren't in the world of restoration, who aren't scientists, who have phenomenal skill sets, that once you put the problem out there, it's amazing how many computer programmers, engineers, graphic artists to help communicate things want to reach out and help. And it's about us owning the responsibility of letting people know our problems so they can help solve them.
That's a great point. And we might get to that one again at the end when we talk a little bit about COVID related impacts. We might want to touch on that one. Let's talk a little bit about this concept. At least this is something that maybe I am struggling with. When I think of traditional restoration or recovery, even for species, I've worked in protected species for a long time. I sort of grew up on the notion that we were trying to get back to something from our past. You know, there were more of these then, or they had a larger range back in the day, and we want to get back to that. Today, when I think of so many changes in the coastal zone and in the oceans, I'm struggling, and I talk with our restoration experts. What are we doing to think about restoration for the future? Why would we restore something if it can't live there anymore? Or why would we restore a species that the conditions are going to be so different they're not going to survive? And then it gets me into feeling like there's a lot of trade-offs there. I would be interested to know if any of you are thinking about sort of the dynamic between restoring what was and restoring to what we believe will be. Oh my gosh, okay. Brice, you want to start that one?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that question. That we think have been thinking a lot about that. The Cayman Islands government has rising water temperatures always on their mind, and for that matter, rising water. But temperature is a really big thing for important fisheries in the region. Most of these large-bodied fishes like grouper and snapper, they spawn in the dead of winter. They spawn at the point in time at which the water is the coldest it gets in the entire year. So it is true then, it must be true, that whatever warming takes place is going to take away from the optimal temperature that they're targeting. It must be true. So we've spent a lot of time actually capturing and raising eggs and larvae in labs and doing temperature treatments to look at the effect of warming temperatures on the early life history of the species, to try and give some sort of forewarning of what may happen to the species. It's not going to happen in the next 10 years, but it might in the next 50. And so the Cayman Islands government is in need of information that sort of reads the tea leaves and says where these fisheries are going to be 50 or 100 years from now.
All right.
And spoiler alert, the news is not good.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah. Who else would like to weigh in on that? Scott?
Yeah, so in the world of coral reefs, we're on this kind of weird timeline. We don't even know what reefs used to look like. We have an idea maybe 30 or 40 years ago, but what a baseline is completely irrelevant to us because we don't know it, and climate change is changing the world rapidly. So we don't have 50 years. We've got to address this now. So everything that we do and everything that the community is looking to do now is about managing for resiliency and future resiliency. So we know things are changing, but we don't know which direction. and what tomorrow's factors could be. So every restoration project has to take into account building and resiliency into the system.
Okay. Yeah, Aaron?
Yeah, to build on that, and also Bryce's comment about the longer term, our perspective on habitat restoration is if the focal species and the systems and habitats they depend on are healthy, then they're more likely to be resilient. You know, intact habitats, intact systems, as well demonstrated, more biodiversity, are more resilient, more able to adapt. And we can't very well predict what's going to happen in the next 10, 50 years. With some certainty, yes, but not high certainty. But we can give the current systems the best chances of successfully adapting to the expected changes and ongoing changes. We're already seeing northward geographic movements, of course, of many species, birds, fish, etc. And understanding that's going to happen, it's up to us to make sure that the systems they're moving into can actually adjust for you.
All right, thanks. Vince?
Yeah, I think the rest of the panel covered a lot what I was going to say, but I will echo the point of resiliency. In the shorebird world, climate change is likely to hit species on a wide variety of ways. Some of these species breed in the Arctic, which is changing very rapidly. Almost all of them use coasts that may eventually be underwater with rising water levels. So trying to get the populations as resilient as possible through any means necessary, even assisted migration, different techniques like that, is going to be important as we move forward. I do think historical baselines are difficult in many ways. They're still useful sometimes, but we're looking at a lot of changes, and resiliency is really the key.
So speaking of resilience, and I know we can tackle this, let's talk a little bit about the elephant in the room. Why are we on video today, right? Well, we have a global pandemic. And I would be interested, I know it's right, it's like I thought I was saving the planet already. I would be interested to know from you all, and I know there's probably some threats to your work out there, some limitations that you're facing as a result of COVID-19, and I would like to hear about any direct impacts you're having. I'd also be interested to hear if you've got thoughts on opportunities that might arise. I know, for example, I've gotten a lot of questions over the last few weeks from folks that really care about our work, about whether there are things they can do to help at the same time kickstart our economy and get people in the field doing restoration projects. And so I know there are folks thinking about that. I'm grateful for that. But I would like to hear from you all your perspectives on how restoration might suffer, but might also benefit from these new conditions. Yeah, Aaron.
I'll jump on that one first. With all the challenges and tragedies of COVID-19, I think there's also a bit of a silver lining from the environmental restoration perspective, and that is we've been talking for many years about the need to fix America's infrastructure, from roads to bridges, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the upstream causes of the downstream effects that we're seeing, such as habitat loss for fish or water quality issues, et cetera, are infrastructure issues. So as I already mentioned in my presentation in Florida, we're a porous limestone peninsula and we have a lot of septic systems. And those septic systems leach nutrients into the groundwater, which then comes up in far away as the coral reefs that Scott's working on. The groundwater nutrients are a huge problem. So I think there are good opportunities to actually use this as a reminder that we need to invest in infrastructure, which, to the great benefit of those who've lost their jobs, will provide a lot of jobs for an extended amount of time. Just speaking for Florida, fixing our sewage treatment systems, which are outdated, the septic issues, various runoff and road issues, is a big investment, but it's also a big investment in our future and provides a lot of jobs that are going to be much needed, actually much needed now, unfortunately. So even with the difficulties we're going through now, I think we can work with our policymakers to actually make that happen and turn something that's bad into a bit of good in the future.
Yeah, in the case of Florida, you and Scott know so well that recreation and tourism is critical to the economy of the state of Florida and a lot of other states. And so the assets that you're trying to restore for the communities, that's a long-term investment in that state. Scott, did you want to add some more?
Yeah, just tying together a couple of the things we've talked about: resilience, local stakeholders. These are key, and especially in light of what we're going through now, it shows that the communities also need to be resilient. You know, the Florida Keys are heavily tourism based. We've been decimated by having to close down. But things like restoration and the Seven Icons project that we're presenting are opening a huge number of economic opportunities for additional diversified work to people. So the price tag on our project is $100 million. And that's going to put a huge amount of money into the economy, creation of new jobs, and diversification of people in the dive industry who, if they can't take divers out, can help with restoration work. And it becomes this feedback loop for the whole system.
Excellent points. Vince or Bryce? Vince?
Yeah, one thing, that potentially could come out of this, there's been a lot of, concern about certain of America's beloved landscapes kind of being loved to death in a lot of ways. And, it's possible people have had kind of a break from being out there in some places, perhaps seeing the, positives for the environment could maybe impact people's behavior in the future. Learn that, a little bit more of a hands-off approach sometimes, loving things from a little bit of a distance could be a good thing.
Yeah, Bryce, did you want to include something?
Yeah, so I guess from my perspective, on this panel, at least unique in that I talked about a non-US based restoration project, and from I think the Cayman Islands perspective, from the perspective of fisheries management there, there's just a lot of uncertainty associated with this disease. Like you and Scott and Aaron mentioned, Florida is hugely driven by tourism in terms of economics, but man, so is the Caymans. And the cruise ships aren't coming in anymore, and the flights full of well-to-do tourists aren't coming in anymore, and that's a huge hit to their economy. And so the big question for me is, what does that ultimately mean in terms of fisheries management priorities and the reliance of Cayman on fisheries resources? Because right now, or at least before this, it was not really a fishing economy to speak of at all. People fish because they like to fish, not necessarily because they needed to. That could change. And so it's going to present new challenges, perhaps not insurmountable, but the future, I think, is at least a little bit uncertain.
Okay. We have a few minutes left. I would love to see if anyone would be willing to tell everyone, our viewers, what got you into this business? How did you decide you wanted to fill your days doing this stuff? Oh, you're all smiling, but so tell us the story, Aaron.
I'll take a shot at that. Yeah, very two important points in my life got me to where I am now. One is I grew up in the Chesapeake Bay, fishing that area with my dad and my uncle. And as I was growing up, the bay was collapsing, 70s into the 80s. Rockfish or striped bass were plummeting, and so I couldn't really fish for them. And so that made a huge impact on me. getting involved in science to kind of address that. And then the second was really kind of a one of those kind of slaps in the face you get. I was in graduate school, and I hosted. I was in charge of creating and hosting a seminar series on conservation biology. And so we invited, I don't know, 7 or 8 different prominent marine conservation biologists to come and talk to the graduate student body about it. And every single one of them said that back when they were in their 20s doing the research around the Western Hemisphere, they just assumed that it would always be that way. And every single one of them lamented the fact that they didn't get in the way to stop the decline. And to hear that from such preeminent people, speaking to graduate students, that really kind of kicked me as far as I've come into the conservation restoration.
Yeah. Anyone else? Vince?
Sure. I'm from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is a rural area with kind of has had a history of an extraction-based economy. I'm from a town that grew up as an iron mining community. Forest, lumber and forestry has always been super important in my home area. My grandfather was a forester, kind of in the 1950s through 1970s timeframe, as a lot of the logged out forests from an earlier era were coming back, and so I had that perspective from him of kind of this early restoration period, and just kind of fell in love with the idea of it, trying to balance economies with natural ecosystems and restoration. And I also was a big birder as a child, so that's partly why I am where I am today.
Very cool, thanks. Got her, Bryce? Yeah, Bryce?
Yeah, so thematically, it sounds about the same. I grew, if you do what you love, right, and what you know. So I grew up diving and fishing, a lot of time spent in the Florida Keys. And so, a career that allows me to do that and to help others have better opportunities to do that, you can't ask for something better than that. So that is really kind of what's motivated me. And the other thing is I've had over the years good mentors, people that have kind of helped me to get opportunities. Your NOS, right? So the sanctuaries I think the National Marine Sanctuaries are amazing, and I've had opportunities to be part of projects and citizen science in the Florida Keys and in Flower Garden Banks. Newsflash: if people don't know, there's coral reefs off of Texas, and out here in the Channel Islands and Monterey. So we have amazing resources, marine resources here in the U.S. and I was fortunate enough to be able to be part of that, growing up and coming through my education and training.
Thank you. Scott, you want to take us home?
Yeah, so my path is a little bit more circuitous. I used to be a scientist, and then a couple decades ago, left science to be an entrepreneur. And I fall into that category of people, once you know the problem, are willing to come back and help. So I left the business world mostly, and thought I could bring a different set of skills and wanted to just help tackle the largest ecological problem I could find, so that my son would one day still have coral reefs to see. So, and that's what
I'm glad you did.
Every day.
I'm glad you did. And I want to thank everyone for your time today. All the panelists, you've been wonderful. Dr. Bryce Semmens, Aaron Adams, Vince Cavalieri, and Dr. Scott Winters, thank you for joining our discussion today. I hope everyone watching this enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot about restoration, and hopefully got inspired to get into the field, or at least pitch in. If you have been watching today's discussion and you want to learn more about the work of these fine panelists and the institutions and organizations they work with and for, please go to the Capitol Hill Ocean website and you will find out more there. And you've heard a bit about where they're coming from. So if you want to get involved or help out, or if you've got, as Scott indicated, if there's problems to solve, and boy, we have plenty of them. Come on, the more the merrier. Pick up your scuba tank, pick up your shovel. Let's get working. Enjoy the rest of Capitol Hill Oceans Week. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Nicole.